I'm really sorry to interrupt this amazing atmosphere. But I think it's time we start our afternoon sessions, if you're all okay with that. My name is Lara Baladi. I'm an artist, an educator, an archivist. I was here last year at Mawrid Center for an artist residency, and it's been an amazing experience. And one of the discussions that we had with Salwa and Nada while we were here while I was here, was to be part of this conference. So I'm incredibly happy that this is actually happening in spite of the floods and the wars and all the things that constantly bring us to places that are making our life more difficult. So thank you also for coming. And I'll be the moderator for this panel. It's a panel which I'm very excited to present to you, and I feel it's going to be very sparkly. So we have very creative people to kind of bounce onto what Nada did before lunch of making this face and saying, oh, you know, these people in the afternoon. So we are not the weirdos. We've decided to call ourselves the cool kids. So one of us is going to be on Zoom. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it from the Republic of Benin, but he's going to join us when he presents his project. So the projects today are going to be projects that are by curators, artists, academics, and wonderfully creative and wonderful human, wonderfully creative humans and wonderful humans, full stop, who work with archive, create archives, but also very much so integrate their technologies in a way that is very integral to their project. So it's going to be a discussion that will try and attempt to talk about a lot of different aspects that these projects touch on. We'll try and talk about appearances, reappearances, about unfinishedness, creative fabulation, critical fabulation, and also sometimes the reinvention of the past in the desire to project an imaged future. We will talk about also the term generative in a way that is appropriate to these projects. And so I will not waste more time. I will introduce you to Jes Fernie, to Sandra Rodriguez, and to Fabiola Hanna, and also to Mahoutondji Kinmagbo, who is going to join us on Zoom. And the first participant, Jes Fernie, will present her work, Archive of Destruction. Thank you very much, and enjoy.
Extra specially tall curators. Let's see if that works. Is that okay? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Lara, and thank you so much to all of you, for inviting me and us to this incredible symposium. I'm so happy to be here. I've never been to the UAE before. Very overexcited, slightly extraordinary circumstances with apocalyptic floods, etc. But yeah, it's so nice to be here. Thank you. I'm going to introduce my archive of destruction and then briefly mention some of the issues that I'm interested in discussing in relation to the thesis of the symposium, but also obviously the kind of issues and ideas around our panel. But before I do that, I want to start with a story. Enclosed 2012 was a project by Algerian artist Amina Menia that revisits the history of an important monument located in Algiers, in the centre of Algiers. This is Paul Landowski's Monument to the Dead, which you can see here on the right-hand side, which was commissioned in 1928 by French authorities to commemorate French and Arab soldiers who died in World War I. I'm sure many of you know it. The expressed intention was to show close ties that existed between the people of Europe and Asia. But obviously, to Algerians, the monument was a celebration of their subjugation and a painful reminder of ongoing colonial oppression. And during the Algerian War of Independence that took place between 1954 and 1962, the monument became a focal point for protests and public expressions of frustration about the progress of the war. And 16 years after independence, tolerance for the monument ended. In 1978, as the city prepared for the All Africa Games, an agreement was reached that it should be removed. One of the founders of Algeria's modern art movement, artist Mawrid Arab, led a campaign to reclaim this physical manifestation of Algeria's painful colonial past, and he encased the monument in a new memory of Algeria's socialist revolution, which you can see here. The irregular shape of Landowski's original structure is echoed in Isiakin's bulging brutalist monolith, a reminder of what remains entombed under the surface. So, just to confirm, this monument is inside this monument. The featureless abstract nature of the structure is dramatically ruptured by the inclusion of two powerful fists that you can see at the bottom that are breaking free from their chains. Now, the archive instruction is all about ongoing narratives and stories that happen through time. And what I just love is to discover stories that have this sort of incredible kind of time-based narrative that just, there's another element to the story and it's never finished, basically. So with this story, it gets more complicated when in 2012, during the celebration of the 50th anniversary of Algeria's independence, a crack appeared in the artist's sarcophagus, and Isiakim's monument began to crumble. Sections of the original Landowski monument, including the faces and the limbs that you can see here, there's a face and an arm and a soldier's face on the right-hand side, began to appear, and a kind of ghostly breakthrough of the past leaked out into the present. The monument was quickly shrouded in scaffolding, and it was repaired. So for her Sharjah biennial installation in 2012, that some of you may well have seen, Amina Menia repositioned the memorial as a double monument, a metaphor for the complex and fraught Algerian-French relationship. And a debate has since developed between those who want to keep the shell and those who want to remove it. And Amenia wrote in the accompanying exhibition material. Okay, thank you. And this is a quote from Amenia. As a representative of the third generation of artists to deal with this memorial, I have chosen to place the works of two artists in dialogue. Mawrid Arab was obliged to cover the original monument, but he offered us the choice, or perhaps the responsibility, to accept or reject it. Reflecting on this gesture, I highlight unseen details, creating links where only dots were left. That's the end of the quote. And Menia produced a publication that included excerpts from Paul Landowski's diary and her own, with playing once again with these kind of gorgeous parallel narratives that exist across time and art forms and languages and generations. And I think there's quite a beautiful kind of layering of stories here that involve three artists in which an artwork is given the space to grow and morph according to the age and context and political, social environment in which it is situated. So what I love about it is the fact that the work then becomes a kind of live, visceral, almost organic entity that generously offers its body to reflect the desires, illusions, aspirations, and dreams of those who inhabit the space around it. So, just to give you a little overview of the Archive of Destruction, the Amina Menia work is just one of 55 artworks that are on the Archive of Destruction website. It's an ongoing international research project that really, in effect, I've been working on for the whole of my career, but kind of more recently and intentionally over the last 13 to 14 years. But I launched it in 2021 after a kind of intense period of work through COVID. So the first thing to say is that primarily it's an online archive. It doesn't exist in a kind of physical form. And this is just a screenshot from the homepage, which is continually changing. It will never be the same. And it's made up of stories about artworks across the world that have been destroyed in some way. It's used quite incredibly. I mean, I am quite humbled by the fact that it is used extensively by thousands and thousands of people across the world now as a research and a teaching tool. These are just some images of the essays and texts in the website. And the project as a whole is made up of a digital archive, as I said, but also publications. There's a series, here's a list of some of the artworks on the site. You can navigate it according to a map, a list, or images. But then I also have produced a series of publications, which I have some here. Please take some. I'm not taking them back to England. They're quite annoyingly heavy, so please help yourself. And this is just the first in a series that I plan to produce over the next, 10, 15, 20 years. And I see those publications as a kind of research tool to use as a mechanism to kind of feed the archive. So it's based on conversations that I have with curators and artists and members of the general public. And what I love about this newspaper is it's easily destroyable. You can actually use it to warm yourself at night. I have used it in my fire. And you can take it apart and produce wallscapes for conversations. So a lot of the time I sort of put them all over the wall when I'm having an event, which means that you have a kind of enclosure for conversation, which I really love. And my view about the archive changes continually, just like the stories within the archive. They're sort of continually kind of updated. And at the moment, I'm thinking of it as a tool and a provocation, an impossibility. Something that is a repository for the unsaid, the undocumented, the uncomfortable. It's intended to be both useful and wildly illusory. At its most basic, it provides stories about public artworks that have been destroyed by institutions, members of the public, artists, and the elements. Spanning 100 years and many continents, it tells cumulative tales about vulnerability, interference, desperation, fear, boredom, and love. And it's employed as a balm for artists, curators, commissioners, and funders who worry about the damage to the bodies of their artworks, reputational bruises, and the shame of getting it wrong. It also provides a platform for conversation about the magical, unruly, sometimes disturbing ways that public artworks can form a live, expansive, visceral conversation with a particular context, political event, or audience. Sorry, I got the slide slightly wrong there. The project challenges the idea of a work of art as a static entity that remains fixed throughout time, a never-changing cultural, artistic, financial commodity devoid of risk, agency, and life. Embedded within the structure of the Archive of Destruction is the argument that artworks are living, sentient things that are able to assume a life of their own and move through contexts, responses, and conditions that add richness and complexity to their lives as well as our own. It's in a kind of continual state of becoming, and I keep emphasizing this because I love this kind of it's almost organic or biological conversation that you have about the past, the present, and the future, but also the artworks themselves. The database is never a static entity. I have to continually update the stories and the actions that happen around it. And Amina Menia's work, is just another view of her installation, brings the past into a current and politically relevant present and moves it on into a hopeful future. It's a durational work that involves the swapping of notes across generations, moving from the voice of a white Western man to that of an Algerian man, and then finally, or maybe not finally, to that of an Algerian woman. It provides a beautiful narrative that speaks of the layering of time and introduces the idea of unfinishedness. That is, archives, projects, and artworks that are constantly evolving, moving between a past and a future, allowing for space for reinterpretation, play, access, and a multiplicity of voices, all issues that I'm hoping we can pick up on in a bit. And play is a really important word here. I think it's maybe something that we'll talk about, but I think the spirit of the archive is really, because it's just authored by an individual, there is a sense of playfulness that maybe is allowed to me as someone working beyond institutions. And obviously also the archive allows me to think about institutional critique and alternative approaches to constructing archives and narratives. You know, it's built by me as an independent curator working beyond an institution. And I think because of that autonomy, it critiques and questions assumptions about who controls stories and who has agency. And I do find it really interesting that I get quite a few emails from people just sort of asking me why their artwork or their institution or whatever isn't in the archive. They're sort of outraged that I haven't discovered their work. And I think there's no sort of exhaustive number of works that have to be in this site. It's a personal narrative that is built around my experience as a white middle-class woman living in Britain, collecting these stories from a very specific network, really. I mean, it's international, but it's still very specific. So it's built on communal memory and personal network and a kind of understanding that it's absolutely not an institutional endeavor. And my interest in playing with modes of institutional archiving, I think, is reflected primarily in the categorization system of the archive, which relates to emotions that are released in the form of destruction. So you have destruction through greed, love, rage, boredom, etc., rather than the kind of more rational, straightforward mode of categorization that an institution might adopt. And then finally, I have become quite interested in the impossibility of the archive. And of course, playing with this idea through the title, which is in itself an oxymoron. How can we archive something that no longer exists? But also, I've become interested in the archive's relation to truth. Can my archive lie? Is it okay that it might contain conflicting memories or narratives? Does it matter that it might have a frail relation to truth? And I'm excited by the idea that our relation to the present is quite clearly subjective, that reinvention or trickery is generative. Can misguided paths be fruitful? These are all things that I'm hoping we can pick up on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jes. Please keep your questions for when all participants will have presented their projects. And our next presenter is Sandra Rodriguez. So thank you, Sandra.
I'm going to check if this mic is now functioning properly. Yes, and so it doesn't interfere. Very good. We are going to talk about a lot of these themes, because we have been very having a hard time not to talk about some of these themes outside even of this space, but also because we create with archives in different forms. So my name is Sandra Rodriguez. I am a digital artist, but also a researcher on sociology of new media technology. And what I have been doing in the last 20 years is creating with different mediums to relate what are the traces we're leaving behind as humans. How do we talk about our histories, our stories, our personal lives, and our subjectives, understandings of what we are, where we're coming from, and where we're going at. Now, whenever I'm talking about my use of emergent media, people ask, what is that? Well, it's every new shiny toy that is out there that promises to bring new ways and new formats for storytelling. And of course, if you talk about innovation, you could mean technology. It's emerging technology. But whenever there's a technology and we get to hear about it in the public, it's because we've created a mediated form to share stories through these technologies. So it's also an emergent media. But then it's media that's not, shared in void. It's shared with the public, and that public is also changing. And then the art forms that are created through these emergent media forms are also disrupting the way they're intended to be used in the first place. So what does that mean? That means that, for once, my dual life became totally rational. A lot of emergent media artists represent new types of artists that need to contribute to the development of the medium. So we become artists, we question, and scientists, we question even more. We disrupt, we break, we look what's inside, we reconsider and reconfigure. And I've had a lot of fun with projects that you can see here to use emergent tools to talk publicly about the tools themselves. So using big data to track an audience to show them how they are being tracked, for instance, or using virtual reality to talk about our subjective perceptions of reality through psychosis, for instance, or using data to talk about what's actually feeding all our algorithms. We're talking about the traces, archival traces and digital traces we're leaving behind. But these traces are seldom what we believe they are. We look at the official, but a third of what we're sharing online is quite unofficial, and a lot of it is content we couldn't be sharing here, for instance. So what does that mean? That means that the way we're using tools to archive our lives or share stories about ourselves and create through these stories have a component, they have a way of being formatted, but they also have a way for us to imagine their potentials and constantly reimagine their potentials. So the way we talk about the tools also influences the way we're going to use the tools. And that's where the artists come in very handy, because they like to go the separate route. I was trained as a documentarian, so again, I'm not an archivist, but have worked a lot with archivists because of documentary. And here too, you can see how I never thought about it. This is on the left side is a project that I've presented last year, Chomsky versus Chomsky, which I will now be talking about. But I could see in the pattern some relationships to this documentary shot in 2007, where we followed a character here, Raúl, in the countryside of Peru, in Rapayan, where they had discovered a pre-Columbian culture that has been undocumented, unresearched. The civilization of Rapayan is older than Machu Picchu, more extensive, and better preserved. Yet it is being destroyed because there needs to be a highway to bring this kid to a school. So who gets to choose what gets preserved and what we repeat as a history? Well, the citizens of Rapayan decided to, whenever they would find elements and artifacts, to keep it in the school. For instance, these mummies, when they're not behaving properly, they need to sit next to the mummies. So that's another way of relating to your history and traces. Maybe that's something that's traumatic or not. But what I thought was interesting is that we were there shooting this documentary. We were following archaeologists. We had very theoretical views about what this all meant. This picture was taken in 2007 by these archaeologists to feed Rapayan's very first Facebook page. And so again, who gets to talk about the history, the past, and the truth gets to change again, this time with a lot of more agency into the hands of the local population. Now I'm going to fast track to new emergent technology, not just social media, but now artificial intelligence, immersive reality, such as extended reality, such as virtual reality or augmented reality. Again, we're now confounding the idea that if these new forms of imagination and creation are possible, it's because they're based on all 20 past years of digital traces that we've been leaving behind. But are all these digital traces everything that we are? Does it make sense that when we ask for an astronaut, we get a Swedish skier, like you see on the bottom left-hand side? Are all astronauts looking like that? I'm not quite sure. So back to 2023, the projects Chomsky versus Chomsky. I was, since 2016, working with the idea that we needed to talk more about the fact that these digital traces are not what we are. They're a snippet of a very hierarchical idea about what we should keep as digitized material and how it gets to be searched. And my main question was, what is it that we're leaving behind? And I like the term leaving behind because it could mean for whom, who's going to see these traces in the future. What are we leaving behind as in the what? In what form are we leaving things behind? But I like the term what are we leaving behind because it also means what are we omitting when we're trying to create digital traces that are supposed to be representatives of what we are as humans. What are we forgetting? What are we not talking about? And Chomsky versus Chomsky came as an idea and a provocation. I was working at MIT teaching a class called Hacking XR to engineers, which I love to be a disruptor. They think they know more than me, and they do. And they are very good with technology, but then I need to teach them to tell stories through these new technologies. And that's where sometimes it gets a little conflating. And I was approached by a young researcher who said he had found a way, if he could find the most digital traces about Noam Chomsky, he could probably replicate the way he thinks. And I thought, is that true? Is this something we can archive, the way we think, the way we talk? For sure we can imitate, but what does it mean? Could we debunk some of these myths by using archival traces, digital traces, to recreate and emulate a human? Of course, that's the lure. That's AI's biggest promise, that it is using our traces to emulate and reproduce the way we look, the way we think, and the way we talk and communicate. But Chomsky, that's the irony, believes the opposite, that it's just, stochastic parrots trying to replicate only a stick figure portrait of what we really are. So I thought, but we have even to dig into more. Whenever we talk about AI, we forget that we often pretend AI systems are actually led by robots, where even today, as we speak, there's a lot of humans that are hired to pretend they're bots, just so that we believe that these technologies are actually fulfilling the promises we create for them. I love this joke. What do you do for a living? I pretend to be a computer that has taken my job. It does feel like that sometimes. What we forget is the notion of choice. We have a choice into what we choose to pick, keep, decide, what the traces we're prioritizing and which get forgotten. So how do we make sure we at least understand how these systems work so we can make better decisions? So why Chomsky, pardon?
I was just wondering if you're real or AI.
Oh yes, I'm totally right. So why Chomsky? I'll get into a video in a couple of seconds that can tell you a little bit more, but through this researcher, I discovered that not only Noam Chomsky is the living intellectual with the most extensive available digital trace, because over 65 years of interviews he's kept free and accessible to the public, so free of rights. So that's an amazing database that you can use. You could probably use Lady Gaga's as well, but at the same time, he's famous for studying the mind and the way we speak. But as I was at MIT, you can go into a building, and the building upstairs is philosophy, then it's linguistics, and then it's AI. And then you realize how they're all connected. Chomsky worked a lot on the theories of natural language, and of course, one floor below, they were working on natural language processing, which is the way we communicate with artificial intelligence. And a lot of AI systems now talk about Chomskyan grammar. And Chomsky himself says, this grammar is not my grammar theory, it's just called this way to sound special, So where do we go with this? This is a snippet of the experience Chomsky versus Chomsky. It was a virtual reality experience, and the trailer says it all, so I'm going to let you hear it.
And what you could call an emulation of the voice and language patterns of Professor Noam Chomsky.
Chomsky versus Chomsky is a virtual reality experience, but in our special case, we're using artificial intelligence to talk about artificial intelligence.
I think the hardest thing about communication is understanding the intended meaning of a message.
So why Professor Noam Chomsky? Because Professor Chomsky has one of the largest, most extensive digital trace. That makes him a great case study to create a chatbot because of all these amazing digital traces. But he's also devoted his entire life to studying the mind.
May I ask, what is your name?
It was quite stimulating, my conversation with Chomsky. And his voice is I find, very close to the real Noam Chomsky.
Le visuel était très stimulant. C'était vraiment impressionnant. On avait vraiment l'impression de se retrouver dans une réalité. C'est ça qui était fou. Là.
J'ai bien aimé l'environnement qui nous transporte dans différentes scènes, différents décors. C'est une expérience unique.
The vision was to make sure that we had an open conversation within a playful experience that was collaborative, multi-user, and that just helped feel like you could explore, peek under, touch, interact without rules and without too much guidance.
Ça t'immerge vraiment dans une autre réalité qui te faisait oublier ton cerveau de la vie de tous les jours. Voilà, de te poser des questions vraiment très introspectives. C'est très créatif, très inspirant, ouais.
Un mélange d'émotions, de réflexion, ça fait poser des questions, ça donne envie de se renseigner, ça donne envie de comprendre.
Ma partie préférée, c'est quand on a eu l'interaction avec les autres membres de l'équipe, parce qu'on a pu collaborer, se dire « Ah, il faut que tu déplaces le tronc d'arbre de ce côté-là », donc il y avait un esprit de collaboration que j'ai beaucoup aimé.
Il nous amène à des endroits où on ne pensait pas aller. Il va arriver avec une réponse, ça va amener une autre question de notre part, puis de fil en aiguille, on se ramasse à un endroit insoupçonné.
This was a very sophisticated interaction. It really, to see the comparison between the real Noam Chomsky or his thoughts and his work and this AI's take on things, it was very thought-provoking.
It's important that we are able to demystify AI to create an open conversation about artificial intelligence, especially at a time when we need one. Sorry, so I left it a little bit long just because I wanted you to hear the person saying, you know, it was quite mind-boggling to hear the differences between the real Chomsky and this AI trained on his traces. And that's the entire point of why I'm here today. It's not just to talk about virtual reality or future of interacting with digital traces, but it's also because it is our recollection of the past is constantly subjective. So for this experience, I was working with the MIT's library special distinguished archive collection. Noam Chomsky left the MIT, and he is not dead. He is still very much alive, and he's even still teaching at the University of Arizona. But he left MIT, and when he did, he just dumped 65 years of notes to the library. So these are all archives, and the archivists at MIT are unsure what to do with it. And I said, can I just access it for once? And they said, sure. Together, we started digitizing some of these archives, but I just wanted to know what these archives look like. And of course, even if you digitize the content, it's hard to digitize the context. You know, Noam Chomsky is a grandfather. This is him babysitting. You have, you know, coffee stains. You have skip, skip, skip because he repeats himself or talks too much and will skip, skip, skip. You have him talking to his wife, leaving little notes. There's a personality that seeps behind everything that's the official profile. But then, of course, you've got fans, and fans online have been archiving all of his talks and transcribing them, but they're not always accurate. Some people use machine learning to do auto transcripts, and sometimes there's errors in them. But you have 65 years of talks that are a little like Wikipedia. People correct themselves. He never actually said that. That was out of context, things like that. So the Chomsky family suggested and pointed us to this as the most official archive source. But then we also prototyped the experience, and we prototyped it in Sundance 2020. We presented it to a public, and then as another part of the archive, we had what people asked of Chomsky, the AI. They asked, what should we do about climate change? Why did you move to Arizona? Are you the real Chomsky? But also, do you like pizza? What would you do with my data? What do you do with my data? And can you tell if I'm conscious? Do animals have language? People ask questions that in and of themselves are feeding my own system. So it's an archive that I'm also using to feed the experience and make the chatbot always a little bit better. But then there's more. You go online and you can deepfake birds because you have all these archives of nature sound that I can use in my experience. We did the same with this voice of Noam Chomsky. This is no words, just a croaking, like that, so we can deepfake the croak. But mostly, the point of the experience, and I'm going to use this as a conclusion before we lose track, the point of the experience was to ensure that the public can make their own mind. We're promised so many things about what AI can emulate, but we often get to see how the systems actually work with the traces and how they're using them. So I wanted the public to try to understand in very similar playful manner, so speaking of play, in a very simple, playful manner, to touch and really be like 4 years old. Try to understand by peeking under the system how it works and how it differentiated Noam Chomsky's vision to what it could recreate. So very quickly, it's a little, what are we leaving behind? All these traces are things he's left behind. But if you tap into a system that's trained to respond like him, the responses will be predicted. And it's just a prediction. So for a lot of our audience members, that was the first time the bubble really got burst about AI being sentient or being able to emulate the mind. Because what happens that just with 3 degrees of difference, the answer could have been totally different. Just 3 degrees different of prediction. And these predictions are based on hierarchies of systems of what gets predicted most. And it gets predicted most because that's words that people share online now. So what are we forgetting about what Chomsky's legacy is? And I didn't used to be a Chomsky fan. I was not a non-fan either. People hate him or love him. I was in the middle. But I got to discover a person that for over 65 years interviewed on linguistics, talks about birds, talks about bees, talks about octopuses, and dating. And I thought, strange how people don't pick up on the things he keeps hammering the nail on. And some of these things are our human capacity to collaborate with mind boggle him. How come when you don't tell another human that you need help, they can recognize the need for help and we can help each other? Machines can't do that. Still to this day, they cannot help each other. They can compete though. That's easier to reproduce. Our capacity for inquiry. How come we keep asking questions? People knew this was a robot, but still asked it, should I move apartments? And I thought, you do know this is just a bot, right? But they kept asking it questions and questions. And finally, our capacity to be constantly creative. And that's also super hard. So there were some gems in there that people sometimes discovered, and they thought, I can't believe an AI answered this to me. For instance, we really are at a pre-Galilean stage. We don't know what we're looking for any more than Galileo did. But that's because it's not a chatbot that responded. That's actual real Chomsky quote when people ask him, what are we looking for? What is the future? And he keeps repeating these answers for over 65 years. So the system is trained to find the most predictable answer he would come up with. So it doesn't mean the AI is really good at answering. It means it's really good at finding what Chomsky would have said. Accelerating here, it didn't just take systems. This is just for conversation later. Please don't try to read all of that. It's way too small. But it's just to show you when people say, so did you use ChatGPT? No, that was our net. So there's so many ways to create your first systems. And if everything else failed, then we used ChatGPT. And when we did, we showed the public. We told and showed the public, this is not a Chomsky response. This is just a response created by a bot. Can you see the difference? And so the public could see the difference between the real Chomsky and the non-real Chomsky. But also, we were all humans working behind these systems. I worked with different teams in different countries, from Germany to Canada to the United States, and teams going on paternity leaves and maternity leaves. Of course not in the US because they don't have any, but that's a different story. All these humans came with assumptions about the traces, what was important, what wasn't, and that contextualized also what was kept and what was left behind. Long story short, I'm an artist and I'm not here to have the best archive of Noam Chomsky, but it's true that since the project was released, a lot of the questions I've received is, but couldn't this thing be done with all of our digital traces? And the answer is, well, think about everything you've ever left online. Is this really what you are? And if we were to emulate what you've left online, would that tell the whole story? That is it for me.
Thank you, Sandra. I didn't expect any less from you, knowing you and knowing how you've been working on this project for the last few years. It's fantastic to see it. Our next participant, equally amazing, is Fabiola Hanna. And I will let you, Fabiola, present your work. Thank you.
I just need a moment to make sure everything is well-sized, because I'm going to switch. Thank you to the conveners, really, truly, for putting us together in this room and online. And thank you to Maha. Thank you, Lara, for putting this panel together. I'm really happy about it. I wanted to take seriously this question of a generative archive and think about what is a generative archive? What is the generative archive, especially in the context of, should I be closer to this, by the way? Can people hear me okay? Okay, thanks. Especially in the context of thinking about generative AI, or what's this generative whatever, and rather than and I could spend equal time on what is an archive, or what is a database an archive, and as my colleagues at the Arab Image Foundation always remind me, the archive is the people who put things together, and it's really that inverted triangle that Kaukab Shbaro just showed us earlier in the presentation of, no, it is the people who make these decisions around how to save what we decide is worth saving. But I'm interested in this idea of the generative component, and thinking, I have 4 characteristics I'll focus on that is informed by my practice as an artist scholar, and specifically this project called We Are History, A People's History of Lebanon, that I've been working on for over 10 years now, and will probably continue to work on it for the rest of my life. I naively walked into it thinking, sounds like a good 1-year project, but it's a lifelong project now. And it's, I could describe it as a one part archive, and I use that term loosely here, and I apologize to all the archivists. The other part is this automated or automatic editing machine that is built using a narrative intelligence planner. A narrative intelligence planner is narrative intelligence is a subfield of AI that's focused on stories, whether it means understanding stories or focusing on what the story can be, or also generating stories, sometimes with more or less success, but it's a field focused on that starting in 1976, to be very precise. And that second part was driven by a desire to refuse stopping at collecting, at distributing, or at just what's called a data dump, just dumping all of these testimonies and memories. It's the memories of people's daily life from 1943 up to today, for people who trusted me with their own memories. So I found it very unethical to just say, okay, here are all these bunch of talking heads that I will put into a grid, because that's the default kind of organizing system we have, is this grid that we've kind of gotten adjusted to, I think, with the Zoom grid as well, But this idea of just putting everything online because that's what we could do and that is what we've been handed as far as tools from computer scientists. But I wanted to think about how could I ethically think through and work across all of these individual testimonies that people have trusted me with. And that's that generative part. Let me just show you a small part of it. And that's where I'll swap to here. This is focused. So I interviewed 40 people that I then built the system around. And that small component, the 40 initial interviews, were based on this specific event that happened in 1981, a 3-month siege of the city of Zahle. And you'll see one version of what people are talking about here, about that specific event. So. I did test this out, and I'm sorry that the audio isn't working now. Let's see why.
بتذكر انه سمعنا على الراديو، اكيد كله على الراديو انه ماشي القصر.
هون نهار ما سمعنا الصبح كنت طالعه انا على الدرج لاخذ لي الحليب لكارلوس لروجيه من ركشة، طلعت لقيت ما في بنات عبسي، كنا نحن بالليل سمعنا انه في شيء هبط، بس على كثرة الضرب ما انه عم بيبين الاصوات مش عارفين نميزها.
هلا انا رحت بعدين مش باول، بعدين بعد شيء 7 ل 8 خبريه وخلصنا شغلنا رحنا مع شو من زياده. لانه كان في قصص مستمره.
That was one version. I could ask my automatic editing machine to say, okay, using that same pool of videos, can I hear a different story? And here's a remix of that.
وماتت وحدة بعرفها رفيقة أختي بالمدرسة بيت المطران.
تتذكري اسمها؟
هدى.
يا أصحابنا ذكرت أساميهم بالأول، توني سهيون وجاد حنيمي وطنبو منصور معهم مدفع 106.
ابن سهيون، توني سهيون.
وبتذكر بنات العبسي توني سهيون، مات على كعب
توني سهيون مات بالبنين، ابن المألوف مات، حاولوا تقطشوا إجرايهم من الحمراء.
صار في حرب، أكلت 4 أزيف وأجت البنين، رحنا خلصنا العرب يعني. شلنا مولى جوانس وإبراهيم ونس. وشلنا 2 3 وابن جورج معلوف قطشوا الإجراي.
أنت لحتى بعدين صار في هدنة واجوا يشيلوا هالردم وهيك، كان اللي مات وبقي هالطفل اللي هو عمره 9 سنين بيت قبلين قطشين اجراه، خلصوه خلاص يعني، بس بده يضل بالمستشفى للصح. وبعدين ما شفته يعني هو وعائلته، بس راحوا اخوته وامه.
بالبنيه ابن المألوف مات، حاولوا تقطشوا اجرايهم من الحمراء.
Sorry, I was displaying the interface and just noticed that my image was there rather than the actual yeah. So this is those 4 characteristics I thought I'd just jump us into. There's plenty more, but maybe as a way to start. A generative archive is one that is informed by context, and in this case, it's having to deal with Lebanese history that is highly contested. This is right after the 2006 war, where this was a normal advertisement, acceptable, no one complained, no one thought it was outrageous, despite all of the infrastructure being completely destroyed. This is just a couple of months after. So I think this is a symptomatic of that kind of the context that this piece is addressing. And it is a context I think of as impossible conversations. It's really difficult to have a conversation about our past in Lebanon throughout the diaspora. It's one you either avoid or intensely argue or fight about. And so the idea or the need, the interface of a conversation, and that's why there's this messy kind of roundtable that would say, I need to put all of these individual memories in conversation with one another, despite them being artificial conversations, constructed conversations, these are things I think would be worth trying to think about in the context of Lebanese history. It might not be relevant in other parts, even though, thanks to colonialism, we have so many histories that have been repressed and silenced. And here's one way of trying to think about how do we talk about our past. A generative archive is a caring archive. Oh no, I really don't have my slides up, do I? Give me a second to fix that. Okay. And in this case, let me go back to here. In this case, trying to think about what can a caring archive look at? And that specific idea of spending time to think about the connections across these individual testimonies, rather than each one having to sit alone and speak for itself. Here is a way of trying to think, how do we ethically think about and imagine what kinds of conversations could happen to get to that point. So it isn't really about agreeing on a specific version of history or saying this is a history, or a story about history. No, they are artificial conversations that have been put together. And it's really because people, the responsibility I feel as an artist towards the people who trusted me with their memories. A generative archive is an open or unfinished archive in the sense that you can continually build and think through, engage with an archive. Here I have, in my case, in this particular case, I don't have a finished, this is the planner system where that is outputting the, all of the specific plan for a conversation. And then you'll see me at the bottom say, okay, plan again. And this is the text based on the words people are speaking, the transcript that they have tied to the video that is then going back to the source. And I'll come back to that idea. It's a generative archive is also one that pays attention to the medium, the language it is used. So the database, I have all of these video transcripts is in JSON, which is this JavaScript object notation. And I like to put both of these, the JSON database and the English translation, where I have Josephine El-Taif, who is describing how this Absi building collapsed and how she heard about it from these passersby. And so you have each of these particular testimonies put under, like hearer, medium, subject, speaker, time, message. That's the those are her words in that message. And if we're not paying attention to the metaphors or the assumptions that we're making as we're encoding this into a different kind of language, then we really can't be proclaiming things like an archive that resists or counters a singular truth or history. How do we counter these grand narratives that we are speaking about, or thinking about how do we build interfaces to archives that are against the grain? How do we build, or what does an archive that is polyphonic, or co-creative, or non-extractive, interact, all these really great ideas and necessary works, but if we're not looking at the medium itself, in this case it's code, and different kinds of translations where we can think about what is gained and what is lost from that translation, because it is an interpretation, like any humanist would tell you, but we're refusing to counter that or really face it through, if we're just adopting a particular tool rather than shaping it. So I'll stop with these 4 characteristics, and I'd really be happy to think about other ones as well, or what a generative archive isn't. Thank you. What do I do with this? Do I need to plug this in somewhere else, the tech team? Okay, for Tonji's.
Thank you very much, Fabiola. Our next participant is going to be on Zoom, and I think he's already with us. His name is Mahoutondji Kinmagbo, and he goes by the name of Tonji. And we're very sad that he cannot be here with us today, but hopefully the Zoom will work and we'll be able to see his another amazing project following the 3 amazing projects we just heard about. So, Tonji, can you open your camera? Are you with us? Oh, here you go. He's coming from the future. Thank you. Hi.
Hi, Lara. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to Sandra, Jes, and Lara for the conversation that we had before this panel and the conversation that we have in the future. So I will switch to my presentation and okay, so here we go. My name is Mahoutondji. I'm a visual artist, but I work mainly with digital medium. My work is a mix of art and digital archiving using creative technology. So today, I'm trying to share with you
Tonji,
my
can you hear me?
project. Yeah.
Tonji,
Yeah.
we're not hearing you very well. Do you think you can maybe do something about the sound? Your mic maybe is not in the right place. We want to hear you well.
Can you hear me correctly now?
Go ahead.
Yes, so I'm introducing myself. My name is
It's a little bit better, yes.
Okay. So I was saying that I'm a visual artist and I work mainly with digital medium. So my work is a mix of art and digital archiving using creative technology, but with a focus on re-examining African story. And today I'm happy to share with you my latest project that I'm producing right now called Home 2056 on exploration of African heritage through the lens of AI and innovative technology. So to provide some context to this, in 2021, the 20 artifacts were returned to Benin by the French government. So that momentum actually sparked a conversation among artists and creators about the significance of Benin art and its place in history. As an artist deeply rooted in my African heritage, I found myself captivated by this event, and the question is raised about authenticity, cultural preservation, and the role of technology in shaping our understanding of the past. So inspired by this discussion, I embarked on a journey to reimagine these artifacts for the modern age. Leveraging the power of AI image generation tools, I set out to create new interpretation of these ancient treasures, breathing new life into them while honoring the rich cultural heritage. So the results were astonishing, as you can see on these images. But even though the prompts used to generate those images were very specific and the output looked really great, the aesthetic of those creations raised a question. Does those generated images really reflect the craftsmanship of Beninese artisans, or are they just a random mix of images found all over the internet? So in order to truly grasp the significance of artifacts, whether they be ancient relics or contemporary creation, we must embark on on a journey back to the origins. Each artifact carries within it a story, a narrative thread that connects it to the people, culture, and events that shape its existence. To careful analysis of historical records, oral tradition, we uncover the stories of the people who craft and use these artifacts, shedding light on the belief, custom, and daily life. Similarly, contemporary artifacts such as works of art, literature, or even technological innovation carry within them the traces of the creator and the socio-cultural context in which they emerge. By examining the influences, motivation, and intention behind these creations, we gain a deeper appreciation for the significance and relevance to our own time. Moreover, by extrapolating from our understanding of the past, we can imagine the potential trajectory of these artifacts into the future, just as ancient pottery fragments have survived the ravage of time to become objects of fascination in modern museums. So to might today's digital artifacts, such as social media posts or virtual reality experience, hold significance for future generations. By preserving and documenting these digital traces, we ensure that future historians and scholars can continue to unravel the story they contain, eliminating the complexity of our contemporary society and its evolution over time. So in envisioning the future existence of artifacts, we must also consider the role of emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence and virtual reality or extended reality to imagine a future where AI algorithms analyze vast repositories of data to reconstruct lost artifacts or simulate historical events with stunning accuracy. So virtual reality environments allow users to immerse themselves in distant civilizations, experiencing firsthand the sight, sound, and sensation of bygone eras. So the journey back to the sources of artifacts enable us to understand the story, the content, and envision the existence in the future. That's how Hanna 2056 was born. It was born from searching to know, since colonial looting, what if the artist before me had access to these artifacts? How would it influence Benin contemporary art scene and daily life? The effects of colonial looting have significantly impacted the cultural landscape of Benin. So I'm intrigued by the idea of exploring how our artistic expression and daily life might have evolved differently if these artifacts remain in the original context. So Hanna 2056 is actually a virtual reality experience that takes the user into a speculative future where the treasure of the Dahomey Kingdom remain untouched. To be able to learn more about those artifacts, the user will have the opportunity to participate into the coronation ceremony of the new king, where those artifacts will be used during different rituals. Even though the main medium here for this project is virtual reality, AI plays a big part on the overall project production. That's because that the focuses of this project is the artifacts and the rituals, because the ritual helps us put those artifacts back into the original context to understand the story while leveraging speculative storytelling. One of the most interesting aspects of using AI here is its ability to analyze vast amounts of data and identify patterns that might otherwise go unnoticed. In the context of Homage 2056, this means delving into historical documents, archival materials, and cultural artifacts to uncover hidden connections and insights that could inform my artistic vision. Additionally, a dataset of contemporary artisan work serves as a foundation for generating future iteration of these artifacts. Through image-to-image generation, we explore various possibilities, balancing historical significance with futuristic aesthetic. From those possibilities, a selection will be then made to recreate 3D models of those artifacts. And let's not forget about AI role in motion capture technology. I think I lost one of my slides. Let me just, 1 second. So I lost one of my slides, but I will show it at the end. AI role in motion capture technology plays an important role in recreating the intricate movement and gesture of traditional African dance. So by analyzing footage of contemporary dancers and applying machine learning algorithms to extract and replicate the movements, our animation that capture the essence of these ancient rituals, preserving them for future generations to experience and enjoy. But perhaps the most groundbreaking application of Homage 2053 is its role in storytelling, drawing on machine learning algorithms and natural language processing techniques are set out to create a speculative narrative that will transport viewers to a future where the artifact of the Dahomey Kingdom remain untouched. So to conclude, Homage 2056 is like more than just an artistic project. It's a testament to the transformative power of AI and its ability to reshape our understanding of its history, culture, and art. By harnessing the full potential of AI, we can unlock new possibilities for creativity, innovation, and self-expression, serving the future where art knows no boundaries. So thank you. That'll be all for me.
Mahoutondji, thank you. Stay with us, please. Maybe we can have Tonji on the screen from the future. We were not hearing you very well, Tonji, so I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions for your project. And I would like to invite all the participants of this amazing panel to continue the conversation that we've started. So just to give you a little bit of to go back a little bit in time, in terms of coming here today, I thought it was important that the participants actually know each other and know each other's projects. So we prepared this panel in a way that for me was new. I think for some of you was new also. We actually met online several times and had lots of conversations. The first one was quite funny because I never made it to the Zoom. I was on a parallel Zoom and I was wondering why nobody was there, but they all met without me and thought that I had done this on purpose. And so they completely engaged with each other and loved each other and found so many things in common with each other's projects. And so I think that in a way that kind of set a tone for how we are here today. And then met again, and I made it that time. And so I was really excited to see that there are so many, there's so much to say about everybody's project, and there are so many common threads, as well as kind of conversations and dynamics that are possible. So I would like to invite the participants to speak to each other, and then bring you, the audience, into that conversation, and hopefully you'll enjoy it as much as we have been enjoying it. A few things that I just want to say before we do this is, first of all, thank you so much. These are incredible projects, and it's always very different to discover a project, but to then hear the person who created the project talk about it. So there's 100 more layers that are so enriching. What really strikes me is the very lively aspect of these works. When we talk about archives, we still, even though it's not so much the, let's say, the language anymore that goes around the archive, but we always think past. Archive means we're collecting things that are traces. However, in these projects, and why I thought they were really amazing and to bring them today here, is the idea of a kind of being propelled in the future, but at the same time, not only with objects from the past, but also reinventing these objects. So whether it's you, Jes, who has to excavate objects that have been destroyed and then kind of re-articulate what they are, whether it's you, Sandra, who has to make sense or try and find ways to make sense of objects that are deprived of, like you said, the context of the archive, and the conversations that you've collected from the lack of history being written. And with Tonji's project, the kind of reinvention of the artifacts and the leftover broken pieces of the artifacts seen through the machine, but, and that maybe didn't come through so much in his talk, but that is being kind of analyzed and using everything else that's around the artifact that's left in the culture of the Republic of Benin to try and understand what could be the closest form of the original form of the object. So using technologies also is an important aspect of your works, and how integral it is to your ideas and your projects. So this is also something maybe we can talk about. And then what else? And then maybe sustainability and how you imagine these projects to live on would be also something good to talk about. But I leave you the floor, and I thank you very much.
Jump on the bandwagon, does it work? Does it work now? Yeah. I'm going to jump on the bandwagon just because I do think the first time we talked, obviously we didn't know each other's projects, so we started talking about, who was doing what. And really the idea of what gets forgotten. I think it's just trying now really hard to archive what gets forgotten. And we've heard even this morning, I thought it was really inspirational to hear the panel this morning talk about how do we make sure that what we're archiving now doesn't disappear. And at the same time, when you're already stemming from cultures of the forgotten, you already see most of the contents of these archives as already forgetting most of the world's population. So in a way, I think paying attention or trying to focus through our different projects on what gets forgotten is maybe a common thread that I'm not sure how, I'm sure you do focus as archivists on what gets forgotten. So it's the context, but is the context historical, social, political, emotional? And the context is constantly subjective. So it's not just about like who gets to tell which stories, but in which moment of history do we attribute specific elements as relevant. If we look at the last 20 years, the World Wide Web is a lot of information. It's a huge amount of information, yet a good third of that is probably just cats, and not to say other things. If you think about it, is this what we need to archive? We're just paying so much attention on data, and right during the lunch I was saying we're slowly starting to realize that our data farms are producing more carbon emissions than our planes. So will we give so much importance to digitized material in 20 years? I'm not sure. I think we're going to have real issues to think this is always the future. It's just for me, it feels like a timestamp. It feels like the 60s, where suddenly plastic is the revolution. And it feels like we're not seeing the consequences of understanding digitized materials as the only solution. So thinking back to your question, maybe a question for the audience and to you is, how do you feel about what we forget? I think we were all obsessed about what is not in the archives, what it keeps getting forget. Tanji, I love your project, you know this, because I'm a real fan of the experience, just because of the amazing opportunity to rethink how history survives even when the archive is stolen.
Can I just come in there? I love the idea of being a kind of detective with the archive of destruction, and I think to a certain extent similar with you two, that you're constantly on the lookout for something that hasn't been told, a story that hasn't been unearthed. And specifically with the archive of destruction, I found that there are stories that are often related to a sense of shame, which many artists and curators speak of when their work is destroyed in some way. There's a sense that we've been humiliated in public. There's a sense that it's kind of revealed, something shameful has happened, and it's certainly not something that I want someone to take a photograph of and put on a website for thousands of people to access. So I've become really interested in this idea of shame in relation to the destruction of artworks, and then shining a light on this for a subject matter. And what's been really heartening and beautiful is that artists and curators I've spoken to have said this is actually incredibly moving. It's an opportunity to talk about something that I ordinarily would want to cover up. But I now understand that this is part of a much bigger story, which in itself is actually incredibly interesting once we move beyond the kind of the embarrassment or the shame. And that if we position this destruction within a broader historical critical framework, it becomes really interesting. And this is what I think is so sort of vibrant and important about this work, is that we can help people position their stories within a different framework that then becomes something that can connect to other communities and other conversations like we were talking about this morning. So I think that's something that we'll try to do.
With regards to this idea of what gets recorded or as a way of resisting what gets forgotten, there's so much to talk about, like the oral history kind of protocols I followed and implemented. But one aspect was making sure that I had women also participate. And anytime I went to ask someone who had been through this 1981 event, a woman, or someone who identifies as a woman, and I would often get the idea or the response that I don't have anything to share. You should go ask the people who fought through the siege, or there's nothing there. But once I convinced them that no, there's something here to share, but at the end of like a 2-hour session, for example, I would have this reaction of like, oh, I did have a lot to share. You have that part. And then the kind of flip side of it is I had interviewed someone, and then she said, I think you should talk to my neighbor. So I said, sure, I'll go conduct this. I explained the project, which was a bit unusual because I would always interview folks, do a pre-interview and give them a good sense of what the project is, and then conduct the interview. In this case, it was just on a, like, oh, go talk to my neighbor. And this person was intensely sectarian. She made assumptions about my own identity, and I'm like, here I am now with an oral history that is intensely against what I was looking for. I'm trying to get people to think together about these conversations we could have about our past, and here's someone using hate speech. What's my responsibility as an author, as someone who's coding this system, trying to think about what do I actually want? This is something that is not conducive to the kinds of conversations, but also I didn't want to censor people. If this is something she was choosing, and I made it clear this is going to be public, and she signed the release, and all that, this is going to be public. I want to make sure that it's something that she's conscious of. And I ultimately decided, as the person responsible for the system, that I would not, the interview itself is in the archive. It's not something I've removed, but it never shows up in the conversations. You would have to search for it and go to look for it. You'd find it as a researcher, as someone who has an account and looking for this, but it would never show up in the work, which is a kind of reverse, like Google has, and thanks to the work of Safia Noble, for example, Google has now changed its position, but for a long time, it was like, we're just an objective tool, a neutral tool that just reflects whatever society feels. So if society is racist somehow, then it's like, okay, it will inevitably show up. But what about the responsibility of these people who are making these tools? What is the effect on that? And that's something that, do you amplify this hate speech? Do you try to say, what do I want to circulate? And that's the kind of responsibility that's in thinking about what gets shared and what doesn't, and goes back to this notion of authorship as we're working with AI and with machines and automatic, or trying to think of speculative ways of thinking about our future. Where is the authorship or responsibility someone has, I think, is key to thinking about what.
And that links to, just to the idea of predictive analysis or text is something that I hadn't really understood. Well, there are many things I didn't understand when I launched the archive. I just thought it was a little thing that was doing on the side, and then suddenly it became this huge thing that lots of people contacted me about. But is the power of Google Analytics, if you look at the details of how people track and search through your website, it's actually terrifying and quite stalky, and I feel unclean looking at the data. But the data is really disturbing. It tells me that all people are interested in is dead white men, and if there's anything beyond that, it's a black hole. We don't know anything about that. And it actually drives me insane, because this is an independent project. It's sort of self-funded through public talks and writing, etc. And I think I'm just feeding the machinery of this bias that these people who just want to know about Richard Serra. There was a massive spike in my website last week when Richard Serra died. But trying to get them, that same person, to then look at Amina Menia's work is deeply problematic. So now I've made a rule. So many people email me about artworks that that should be on the website, and they are predominantly Western white men. And my rule is now only people of color or people beyond that kind of bubble, and women. And it's a sort of very considered position that I hadn't really, it was naive, but it was so interesting to see the way that computer technology is, to me, it's not creative, it's just reinforcing the narrative that we've been fed. Maybe Tonji, that links to what you were talking about.
Yeah, so can you hear me? Yes. Cool. So one thing that was interesting when I was working on my project.
Tonji?
Yeah?
Can you try to, we want to hear you more clearly, but we don't know how we could do this. Can you try something just so we can hear your voice more clearly? Maybe remove the headphones.
Let me check.
Yeah, maybe remove it because it sort of creates a resonance. Try now. Can you say something? Don't just talking. No, now we can't hear you.
Yeah, now I can't hear you.
Can you hear us? No. So I think, okay, well, can you hear us? I mean, hear me now? Can you hear us? Can you see us? Can you?
I can see you, now I can hear you.
Okay, so, okay, well, let's do our best to pay attention and you articulate even more than usual so that we can really understand. Okay, try.
Okay. So what I was trying to say is that when I was working on my project, the interesting thing was that I was going to some old people that are still living in the kingdom to get more information from them, their memories, because in a way memories also is archived, and sometimes you get different answer from different persons, and sometimes those answers are really opposite from each other. But still, it was interesting because you can still recognize some patterns in the answer in some way, because most of the information that you have to get from people that live here is what they know from the memories. It's actually some oral history. It's not writing, so you have to rely on that information. And now when you search for literature, and that is mainly from the perspective of the colonizer, you can also understand in a way what the old people in Benin refer you to. And I find it interesting that even when you have opposite answer, you can still recognize the pattern of how those artifacts were used or who actually created those artifacts. Yeah, I don't know if you are ready to hear what I just said.
Can you hear me? Yes. Yes, I think we understood what you said. I think I'll try and sum it up. But basically, you've been having a lot of conversations with a lot of different people on different aspects of the culture of Republic of Benin in relationship to these artifacts that you found, to try and find traces maybe outside of the actual trace of the object itself, to try and recreate this object and using AI. Is that correct? Did I?
Yeah.
Did I get it right?
Kind of, yeah.
More or less.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah, so basically, I mean, what I think is amazing about your project is there's, in the last 10 years, maybe more, there's been a big emphasis on VR experience in relationship to museum archives. These projects become exciting because for a lot of people it is a new media, not really, depending on where you position yourself in that field, but it's also for many people, or at least for the audience of museums, it's a new experience to see the objects from a museum being kind of virtually displayed and using VR as a way of display. And I think what's really interesting with your project is that you are going beyond that kind of duality of the display mechanisms with the objects by creating an environment that is, while it takes sources in the memory of your culture around conversations with people and other ways, you're also bringing a fictional dimension to your project and kind of staging this visualization of these objects and encounter with these objects in a civilization that is beyond the one that we know, using also tradition and spiritual, the cultural and the spiritual aspects of the project, I think, is also fantastic. And within this VR experience, you're using also AI and other media to convey these stories and these ideas. So I actually did a screenshot of what was it? I don't remember. I think of your slideshow. I'm not sure you showed that today, but it's the caption of the screenshot says the user is in the King's Council room and chats with him through the King's AI assistant. And I think that's just amazing to bring the kind of collapsing the present, the past, and the future in your project, and I think that's really quite an achievement. And that sense of collapsing time and also of generosity appears a lot in everybody's project, where there is not just an attempt to tell us about the past, but also to propose and to offer something that is maybe generative or generated from the past into the future. So that was my intervention, but if any of you wants to ask a question or say something before we can move to the audience.
I was just going to say, because of, now we're talking about Mahoutondji in the third person tense, just because we're trying to fill in some of the gaps ourselves. But you've said, I think, or better showed very eloquently, the problem with the databases, how the systems are biased in and of themselves, the content is biased, the way it's prioritized is biased, and then we add to that our own bias. When you try to ask for an AI generative image of, what a casque, I'm not sure if you would translate it as a helmet or a hat or ceremonial hat, I'm not sure exactly what, la calebasse, that's like engraved calebasse, you can really see, and that's sometimes what we forget, when we see generative AI images, we're amazed by what they can reproduce. I usually can really tell, the inspiration of medieval Western, royal references, just in the way that it's engraved and how the, semi-precious or precious stones are displaced. You really see the Western bias within that image. And I remember you talking about your project and saying you're trying to avoid Afrofuturism to create Afri-futurism. So I'm not sure if you want to explain a little bit why that different is, how, and if they can't hear you, I'll try to paraphrase it and you can give me a thumbs up if it's good or not.
Okay, so the Afrofuturism is actually futurism from the point of view of Black people in America, but also in Europe. So there's a lot of bias from that. If I take a movie like Black Panther, it's really Afrofuturistic. So there's a lot of things reference to Africa who are not really true if you live on the continent and you experience the culture. So the idea with Afrofuturism or African futurism is to imagine the future of Africa from people who were born on the continent and are working right now on the continent. So that's the idea around the difference between Afro and Afrofuturism.
So I was super clear. And it goes to show the difference in the databases, because quite literally you're using a database that is, taken mostly of what gets prioritized online as royalty, heritage, and recreating something of the past versus using your own database. And when you feed in your own database and change the database, even if the system is skewed and biased, the results still looks more like the original. And so I remember in our very early, sorry about repeating myself, I think I've had that conversation right before lunch, but it just helps me think now. In 2030, when we initially met, we were told United Nations official data that by 2030, 50% of the world population under 35 years old will live on the African continent. And it gave me hope, because I thought, well, even if the systems are not made better, the data is going to change. And we just need to ensure that we need to understand that a lot of the ways information get filtered through, if you change the database, you change the output. So how will we archive all of that? It's again a fighting of what gets prioritized and what doesn't. So thank you for the distinguishing Afri and Afrofuturism. It made me think of your way of, your first example of showing a piece that's reinterpreted by, it doesn't mean that, you know, one competes with the other, it's just different things that are remembered and different things that are forgotten from the same source, and both can live and coexist. So Afri and Afrofuturism.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's super interesting in relation to the archive of destruction. I've always wanted to sort of consider this issue of the relation to a kind of specific narrative that we all adhere to or buy into, and then position it in relation to an idea of truth, you know, how the archive tells, you know, a truthful story. And I remember when I was working on a large-scale commission in a very, very rough neighborhood, I remember everyone telling me, Jes, it's not going to last a minute, it's going to be vandalized, it's going to be destroyed in a flash. This is before I'd thought about the archive of destruction. And to kind of protect myself against this idea that it would no longer exist, I wrote a press release which sort of goes through the relationship of the work to the site and how the sort of inherent sense of vulnerability was an important part of the sculpture. I mean, it was a really ridiculous press release. But anyway, it never got touched. It was never destroyed. It was fine. But what I was really interested in was the idea that this press release is now in my archive. And if someone reads that, they would think, well, that's the end of the work. It didn't exist. Let's move on, the next one. And then someone was telling me later, well, this is, you know, this happens throughout history. This is a great, you know, kind of story in relation to 20th century American sports, space excavation. And it was a story that I was telling you when we first met, this, when Apollo 11, I think it was, in 1970, was in jeopardy. There was a situation where all of the astronauts on board were very likely not to make it. Nixon's press team decided to get him to make a statement about the fact that the astronauts had died, but they died all with a good cause, and da, da, da. So that tape is on a file somewhere, you know, in a sort of archive next to my little press release about my artwork. You know, it's all like an alternative universe, basically, and that got me thinking about this idea of pathways and truths in relation to, you know, the kind of stories that we tell, and how interesting it is that maybe there are other routes that we haven't taken that aren't necessarily, they're just alternative. I don't want to say alternative, I'm not even, you know, I'm not going to say it, but they're kind of other ways of thinking about, you know, our experience. I remember talking to one of the artists in the archive, trying to get the story straight from her, and she kept changing it, and she said, oh, I don't think I remember right, that may not be true. And I thought, well, this is great. Maybe there are just 7 versions of this story, and that I can, you know, somehow be honest about that. I don't need to create this perfect form.
To your point, we were talking about, you know, the moon potential disaster, and I told her, I told you, I didn't know it was actually filmed. All I know is that there is a team of artists that recreated deepfake Nixon's speech called "In the Event of a Moon Disaster," because that was the title of the text. So they never found the recording, but they found the text, and they actually just created a deepfake announcement of Nixon announcing that there was a moon disaster.
Yeah, you've got to check it out. After Sandra told me, I was like, this is fantastic. It's like we're creating our own sort of parallel version in our little Zoom room.
Yeah, the exact title, I think, is "In the Event of a Moon Disaster." So maybe we should move to the audience, because I think we could be here forever. So I would like to, I don't know how much time we have left, maybe 20 minutes, not even 15. So I would love if, you know, if any of you have any question, we are here to answer them if we can. Anybody?
Thank you very much, all of you. My question is to Sandra. Everything that you explained was also very interesting. And I was wondering, when you were saying all the time, we, who's we?
It's an entire team. So I know that I have a tendency to do this. All of my projects, I talk about we. Maybe that's the documentarian background. You can claim you're an artist or you're a director, but you never work in silo or by yourself. So the experience, I have a vision for it, but then I also have producers that have a vision for it and will support or finance, or the collaboration with the Chomsky family, for instance, or the MIT library, but also teams of coders. The last image I had were all the people that worked on the experience. Even if I have a vision for it, everybody influences the experience in some kind of way. And so I have a tendency to want to see the work as collaborative and collective. Otherwise, it's also obfuscating, all these other truths that are also part of the experience and the end result. But it's not me and my doppelganger AI. Mm-hmm. Oui.
I'll echo all the thanks. It's extremely exciting to enter this Zoom room of our parallel stories and survivals. I think my question's for Fabiola. It was really interesting to hear you share this detail about the story that is sort of suppressed. And it made me think about stories and maybe what I'm detecting. You talked about care, and there also seemed to be a therapeutic aspect of the project. And I say that partly because there are all of these harm remediation techniques after an event of gathering testimony and then having actors, for instance, play it out back to a community that needs to bear witness and can't. So there's an element of that in this, and yet it seemed like you made certain choices. The stories play, but the faces of the initial owner of the story isn't deep faked to be seeming to say that. So I'm just curious about the decisions you actually make in that user interface so that the stories get generated, but there are obvious visual limits to that kind of storytelling.
Yeah, thank you. I actually noticed the videos weren't playing properly, so the stills that were appearing were actually video, so you could see the people speaking. But you're right, there's, I think of this interface as a very user-unfriendly interface, and it's on purpose because I want people to listen. I'm trying to encourage through these conversations a user accessing the website to come in and listen into a conversation that is already happening without them, but then they could also add their own memory and place it into the archive, and therefore, not instantly, but at some point it would modify the data itself. There's so much to share about the different kinds of stories, but maybe thinking about the aesthetic choices of going back and returning to the source. So this idea of generative is, yes, the database itself that is generating the stories is from people's words, the transcripts they use, so it's a very textual one. I think of always incorporating, how about the gestural one, or one that's focused on the rhythms of speech, and try to make those kinds of connections, and someday I'll work on that. But right now it's based on the specific words they chose to use to represent their memories, which would change across time. So to think about, I conducted these interviews in 2010, and I would get very different ones today from the same people. So how do I represent that kind of change? And so saying this is a text that generates a story that is artificial, doesn't exist, is completely constructed and imagined, but I return to the source, and that's the slide that Tonji had about returning to the source, is thinking about this move back to what people actually are saying as a way of representing them in a way that, yes, in an unfriendly user interface that also evolves because you start out not being able to even pause or click or change a story except to remix it. You could obviously close the whole project if you want to refuse it, and I'm happy with that. But the idea of, as you listen to more of these remixes and stick with the interface, then you can actually gain access to saying, okay, I want to see this whole video, this whole interview uninterrupted. But you only get to that point once you've engaged enough. And so it's this idea of the more you listen, then the more access you gain. But that's not the default starting point. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing your work. It's really interesting for me to hear it. So Fabiola, you mentioned that sometimes even when we think everything is AI, there's of course like people working behind human decisions. So I wanted to ask Sandra and Jes, Fabiola mentioned the time when she had to make a decision. You still recorded the work, but you chose to present it differently. So I was wondering, Jes and Sandra, if there were times when you also had to make a decision, or there was a human creative decision that someone might have interpreted as being like AI, probability, or statistics, but it was actually your choice. Thank you.
In my case, it was, I really like the idea also that work can get destructed because of institution decisions. The experience is co-produced by Canada National Film Board of Canada, so it's public institution, and Germany, it's Schnellebunte Bilder, so it's private studio. Okay. The National Film Board kept insisting on better tools, newer tools. Bear in mind, the experience started in 2016. Before they actually got on board and thought there was a future in an AI project, because they didn't believe it for 2 years, it was 2018. By the time we got the funds, it was 2019. And of course, each time the technology advances, and each time it did, they wanted me to get with the new GPT 3.5. And that needed to be the new solution. And whenever I tried it, I thought it was very bad. It just, spewed out the same things that you would see in any other advertisement over and over again. Didn't sound like Chomsky, didn't have his feelings and have his theories, had nothing of him. So I kept, that's the waterfall effect that I was trying to show before. My conscious decision was to be super transparent about every step to the public, to the point where when they would outboard the experience, they had an entire wooden board where they could play with it to understand where I made which decisions. And there are AI researchers that saw the experience and were there to test its innovation. And NFB wanted for the innovation to be the AI. And they said, what's the biggest innovation of the experience is that wooden board. Because the problem when we talk about a black box in AI is not that it's so complex you can't understand it. It's because it literally is a locked black box. Nobody wants you to see how it's made, because that's money. So they said your true innovation is showing the public where you've made your decisions in the system and how it works. So we can be the judges of what we think is right and what we feel is not right. And current AI systems don't show you how they work. They show you the end result. And when the problem or difficulty of making decisions with these systems is that we don't own, even if we decided to, again, we researchers, AI researchers, coders, developers, and myself had to come to terms together with a collective decision. Some of us really wanted to push to the newer the technology, the better. I was trying to stay loyal to the real text and the real archival material that I had. And that was a fight. I was surprised how little they cared if it was truthful, as long as it seemed technologically savvy. That's a choice, that's a difficult choice, but what will we choose, to make it feel like it's real or burst everyone's bubble and show, that's the real sentence, that it answered to a journalist asking it, for instance, what is the meaning of life? That is the real answer. This is the generated answer. Trained on his own material, trained on predictions about his own material, that was the waterfall. First, the real answer, then the answer generated from his own material, then the prediction of what should come next, and then, ChatGPT as an end result. So you could really ask the same question 7 times and see the waterfall, and it explained like which was the truer and which was less and less true and more AI. My personal choice was to show this to the public. I was told, bad decision. You could sell this. And I thought, sure, but then I'd have probably Chomsky's family on my back, A, and I don't want that. And B, what am I leaving as a legacy for other people? Is it still alive, a system that doesn't show how it works? And, then nobody can do anything with it. So I chose no money, but transparency. That was my choice.
Just to answer your question from my point of view, the answer is no. I haven't even considered the archive of destruction in relation to the kind of digital material angle. And what I love about this invitation from Lara is an opportunity to look at this thing I've made from a completely different vantage point. And it's so great to have these conversations and think, so the archive of destruction is also this other thing that exists within this, binary numbered system. And it's made me think about how it's a self-authored object in, as it stands in 2024. What do I hope for it in the future? Where will it be? And I'm absolutely convinced that it's incredibly self-authored. There's no sense of a kind of a we. It's definitely an I situation. And I very tightly keep hold of the curatorial reins and the language and the kind of feel of the whole project. But what I've become really interested in the last couple of weeks after talking to you guys is this idea that I kind of hand it over to another entity that is maybe beyond AI. So I do think that there are so many deeply problematic issues in relation to AI, and it is just a kind of harvesting of a preconceived language or material. But something beyond that has a sort of more fluid biological relation to our cells or to, plants or animals. I'm being a bit fantastical here, but I can imagine handing it over to something that then makes the archive grow in a way that I had never conceived and goes way beyond my understanding of what is possible. But that's totally not about AI to me. Maybe it's my very shallow understanding of AI, but I think there's something much, much more interesting beyond that, which would possibly mean that humans aren't even part of the story. So, there's the archive going off beyond us all.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Tonji, also, and thank you for your for being here and for your amazing questions and your patience. Don't forget that you can pick up an issue of the Reader 1 of Archive of Destruction. It's on the first table here. And maybe just a little word of conclusion, given that your projects are the archive and let's say the container of the archive are so interrelated and in communication with each other, maybe I want to say as an ending word, the archive is the medium. And thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.